Hi, my name is David Irvine, and I'm the host of Dangerous Goods Matters, the AIDGC podcast. This podcast has been created by the Australasian Institute of Dangerous Goods Consultants, otherwise known as AIDGC. And the podcast is designed to provide an interview series focused on practical, real-world issues in dangerous goods and hazardous chemicals. We will be speaking with AIDGC members, regulators, industry practitioners, and other subject matter experts about storage and handling, transport, regulatory changes, case studies, lessons learned from incidents, and other practical approaches to improving risk management. While our focus is Australia, we will also explore how other regions are addressing similar dangerous goods and hazardous chemicals challenges and what can be learned or adapted for the Australian context. The objective of our podcast is simple. Firstly, to provide practical value for AIDGC members and the industry as a whole. Secondly, to showcase the depth of experience within the AIDGC community. And thirdly, to help make dangerous goods and hazardous chemicals information clearer and more accessible for industry practitioners. A little bit about me. I'm a consultant member of the AIDGC. I'm also the Managing Director of DG Trainer, which delivers dangerous goods training, and I'm a CASA certified dangerous goods instructor. I'm also the CEO and co-founder of DG Expert, software designed to help organisations manage dangerous goods compliance for storage and handling across all jurisdictions in Australia. In today's episode, we're discussing the comprehensive review and rewrite of the Australian Dangerous Goods Code. Joining me today is Matt Arkell from the National Transport Commission. Hi everyone. In the episode today, we're going to be discussing a comprehensive review and rewrite of the Australian Dangerous Goods Code. I've got Matt Arkell from the National Transport Commission joining us today. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
As you know, Matt, this is our first episode of Dangerous Goods Matters, and we felt that being in Australia, the big rewrite of the ADG Code is a great place to start. So you are always going to be our first choice.
That's fantastic to hear. It's been a long journey, this ADG Code, right? So
I'm sure it has been. Look forward to hearing about it all today. So I thought maybe a good place to start, Matt, would be to tell our listeners a bit about your professional background and your current role at the National Transport Commission to kind of help set the scene a bit.
Sure. So after leaving high school, a long time ago now, I went to uni and got myself a chemistry degree, and sort of worked my way through some of the various parts of the world of chemistry, a bit of research and development, a bit of lab management, a few sort of bits and pieces. But what really ended up being the thing that snared me was the sort of quality and compliance management, risk management side of things. And so I got quite dug into quality management, and there's an element of dangerous goods in that.
Yes.
With my field, but it was only sort of after I really got my teeth into that all of a sudden the world of dangerous goods came into view, and I was working as a quality and compliance manager for an importer and distributor of chemicals. And that was when I really got into the world of dangerous goods. Not long after that, I joined the New South Wales EPA as their principal technical advisor for dangerous goods transport. And then from there onto the National Transport Commission, where I'm now principal policy advisor for dangerous goods transport.
Great. And I guess the transition from the EPA over to the National Transport Commission was a logical one, given that you had sort of a transport focus towards your time at the EPA.
Yeah, it's sort of a bit of an artifact of Australia, is the way we set up our transport policy for land transport in Australia. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mess, but that's the way we like it.
Yes.
Land transport is regulated at the state and territory level,
Yes.
but it's a little bit crazy to have completely different rules between every state and territory. And so the National Transport Commission's role is to work towards harmonisation in that, and set a common framework to work within.
Some of the topics we're going to get in today is sort of like to unpack that a bit, because I think it's important for people to kind of understand that. I mean, I run a dangerous goods training the business, and part of that is training people. And I think when you kind of explain how the regulatory obligations work when it comes to transport, I definitely always get a few raised eyebrows when they go, really? And so I think that would be good. So how do you kind of feel, and maybe more specifically around the transport stuff, like how is that dangerous goods regulation in terms of, say, land transport? How has that kind of evolved over time? And we don't need the whole sort of timeline, but, how have things moved, let's say, over the last, 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so if you sort of look back to, say, the late 90s, for everybody who was around then, what we'll call the ADG 5 era, that's when we've got a fairly consistent application of the Dangerous Goods Code across the country, and a fairly common legislative landscape, and we've maintained that throughout the last 25 plus years. And in my experience, the world of dangerous goods transport is actually probably one of the better harmonized areas. Certainly the transport that occurs under the ADG Code itself at the moment, and that's largely down to the fact that the ADG Code gets to function as the sort of common technical rulebook for dangerous goods transport, and then the legislation that enables the ADG Code, that's its main function. Its main function is to enable the use of the ADG Code rather than trying to set individual parameters within legislation, which is always a tricky beast to do across jurisdictions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that was one of the things that I was going to ask, which I think you've kind of answered it there, is like, how does the ADG Code interact with each of the state and territory legislation in terms of enforcement? Maybe that would be a good clarity to make about where enforcement happens and what is the ADG Code's role in that enforcement, if any?
Yeah, so all of the actual regulation, the regulatory effort happens at the state and territory level. There's no Commonwealth regulator for dangerous goods transport, and that means that the National Transport Commission, so our role is as a policy setting body. We work with the various jurisdictions and with industry to develop that common technical rulebook, the ADG Code. And then maybe off to the side is a way of thinking about it. We also work on a model legislation that is then implemented in each state and territory. And the model legislation is where you'll find things like who has to do what and what the penalties are for non-compliance.
Yep.
And so that legislation is then made in each state and territory on the basis of that model, and the local regulators, whether competent authorities, such as, in New South Wales, the New South Wales EPA and Safe Work New South Wales, in Victoria, WorkSafe Victoria, and so on, they are the ones who actually are responsible for implementing and enforcing the legislation.
Out there in industry, or when you're talking to people, what do you think are some of the common misunderstandings about the ADG Code that you kind of hear on a regular basis?
I actually tend to think that the understanding of the ADG Code is reasonably robust. Probably the biggest challenge that people face is just the sheer volume of the thing.
Yes.
There's nobody who hasn't stared at all 1,300 odd pages of the ADG Code and thought, "Oh, what have I got myself into?" It's I guess one of the biggest misconceptions is that people sometimes treat it as if it's a book that you read cover to cover.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's not the way it's intended to be used. It's not written that way. Certainly the first part, that's the case, but generally it's a case of, I need to go and find the thing that I need to find. I need to understand how that interacts with the other parts of the ADG Code as well. That's important. But it's not so much it's not a novel.
Exactly. Well, I find that running training as well, if I'm going out there, and just conveniently, I didn't do this on purpose. I actually have the copy of the ADG Code running with me in case you ask me some questions during this podcast. No, but I find when I go out and run the training, I'll have the books and I'll say exactly what you just said, Matt. I said, this is not a book. It's not a novel that you read from beginning to end. Yes, the intro and some of that stuff. Once you know how to read the dangerous goods list and understand what all of those columns in the dangerous goods list mean, that yes, there's other bits of the book that you need to refer to, but it's really like a map to how to interpret the rest of the ADG code. And I think once people get their head around that, then I think the intimidation factor goes down. I think when people first see it, and if they're not experienced in it, and they say, oh my God, how am I ever going to remember 1,300 pages? I'm saying that's not how you read it. You need to understand the methodology and the process. Once you understand the methodology and the process, even if you don't touch it for 3 months, when you pick it up again, if you understand how that process works, then you'll be able to interpret it in the right way.
Yeah, that's right. And one of the other things that people should remember, and it will depend on what level you're working at, is that the extent of information that you might need out of the ADG code can actually be quite limited at times. If you're a consigner of dangerous goods, if you're shipping dangerous goods, or even if you're importing dangerous goods into Australia, a lot of you probably don't have a huge range of chemicals that you're handling. So the actual amount of content that you need to search for can often be quite limited. And sort of likewise, if you're a transporter of dangerous goods, it's also, you may be transporting a much wider range of materials, but the things that you need to do are much more narrow in focus. The way you secure a drum of flammable liquid and the way you secure a drum of corrosive liquid on a truck are fundamentally quite the same. It's I would probably say that if you think about the philosophy of dangerous goods transport, and this runs all the way up to the UN, transport is not handling chemicals in the way that you handle them in a workplace. The principle is that they go into a packaging that is appropriately designed and has been tested, if appropriate, for the chemicals, and they stay in there throughout the transport process. They don't come out. Now, obviously, there's a few nuances to that when you start talking tank vehicles and things like that. But, for the most part, people aren't interacting with these. And so a drum of chemicals is a drum of chemicals in a lot of ways. Who is the primary audience for the ADG code, and who should be paying attention when changes are happening? I mean, essentially everybody in transport should be aware of the ADG code if they're going to come across dangerous goods at any point in time. But the level of awareness that they need varies. If you're in my previous role as a quality and compliance manager at an importer, you need a much more detailed knowledge of things like classification and those sorts of things. Selection of appropriate packaging, perhaps. If you're loading dangerous goods onto a vehicle, the things that you need to know are a little bit more specific. And then if you're driving a truck, then it's different again. And I will come on to a little bit later on about how those changes in the new code do interact with those sorts of roles. It's important to understand that you don't need to know what every single tiny little change is that's happened across the way. Life is mercifully not quite that complicated.
Yes. Yeah. And in terms of updates to the ADG code, what is the typical kind of cadence that we see with updates to the code, like say going from 7.8 to a 7.9? What does that typical sort of cadence look like?
Yeah, so we follow the United Nations model regulations that runs on a 2-year cycle. So every 2 years, a new edition of the UN model regulations for dangerous goods transport are published after 4 meetings in Geneva over a couple of years. And we then follow that at that sort of 2-yearly cadence. And that keeps us in pace with the rest of the world, both for land transport but more importantly, given that Australia is surrounded by water, sea and air transport, who also operate on that same 2-year cycle.
Yep. And then sort of, I'm going to kind of start to transition us over to what's going on at the moment, and I imagine taking up pretty much all of your time, is the current review that's underway. And so, I guess at a high level, like what is the current review underway, and, why are we doing this comprehensive review and sort of, I don't know if rewrite's the right term, but rewrite of some sections potentially, it would be good to kind of understand a bit of that backstory before we kind of dive into the detail about why the rewrite was necessary. Like, what is it and why are we doing it?
Yeah, maybe a little bit of history is instructive here. If we go back to when we transitioned from ADG 6 to ADG 7, during the ADG 6 and earlier eras, it was the ADG code was fundamentally a paper book at that point in time. An edition of the code was published, and it would last for sort of 5 to 7 years, roughly. That then, with ADG 7, it was rewritten using the UN model regulations as the base document. I would describe a lot of the Australian land transport stuff being bolted onto the back. One of the features of the UN model regulations is that they're non-modal in nature, so they don't address the modal requirements like for land transport or for air transport or sea transport. And so after a few years, that was reviewed, and the National Transport Commission moved to a fairly sort of consistent 2-year cycle, again following the updates to the UN model regulations. That works quite well. One of the ideas around the time of ADG 7 was aligning to ADR, the International Road Dangerous Goods Code. For a variety of reasons, that didn't happen. But then around about 5-6 years ago, the NTC did some work looking into whether it would be appropriate to change the legal basis on which we write the ADG code, or whether we should we move towards an applied law model or something like that instead of the model legislation that we use now. And one of the things that we heard during that process was the code itself is where most of the problems are arising. And it became fairly apparent fairly early on where that was coming from. Essentially, the problem is that the non-modal, the UN model regulation derived parts of the ADG code were being kept updated, but there was a large amount of content in the ADG code that wasn't, because it was Australian specific, difficult to maintain. It takes a lot of effort to come up with new changes to things, incorporate them, make sure you don't break other things when you do incorporate them. And so they had not kept pace. And so we revisited the idea of aligning to the International Road Dangerous Goods Code. It's probably also worth noting at this point that a decision was taken quite early on that we wouldn't become a signatory to ADR. That is certainly an option, but for Australia's transport needs, that doesn't really work all that well.
And so what does that actually mean, Matt, in real terms, if we were to become a signatory to the ADR? What does that practically mean, or what? I know we're not going to do it, but what would that mean?
It would require us to take on a number of rules that don't look like dangerous goods transport in Australia. For anybody who has driven a car around Europe, you'll have noticed that they don't, for the most part, put diamonds on their trucks.
Right.
They use orange plates. There's a different attitude towards segregation. They do that much more at the consignor level. Their transport operations tend to run differently, with much more point-to-point transport instead of hub and spoke, which is how the Australian transport industry often operates.
Yes.
We have a lot more consolidation, deconsolidation, and most notably, much bigger vehicles. In ADR countries, absent a derogation, you're only allowed to put dangerous goods onto a vehicle, either a single vehicle or a prime mover with a semi-trailer. That would not work in Australia. And so essentially what we would then need to do is we could adopt ADR, but we then have to write a second book that goes along with it that says, and here's a whole bunch of sections that you've just read that don't apply, and read these in place. Possibly more work.
Yes. Which is, I guess, one of the primary objectives is to make it more sustainable going into the future.
Exactly.
And so the need to do the rewrite and the realignment, was that based on just a lot of feedback from industry, or were there some particular incidents, or were there some things that happened that was a catalyst for the change? Like, why did we have this? I think it makes sense, but I was sort of keen to understand the why and the catalyst that started this process.
Yeah, it was primarily feedback from industry that ADG 7 was working well for it often has worked quite well for really core dangerous goods transport. If you're transporting petrol in petrol tankers, the ADG code as it stands is pretty good for you. Where it tends to break down is when you get into more niche areas. It starts to, because a lot of that content did come from the earlier editions of the ADG code that maybe didn't consider those as fully, you run into a few problems. So part of that's part of the impetus for following ADR. When ADG 7 came into force, there were around about 900-ish million people living in countries that were signatories to ADR. Yes. Now it's around about 1.2 billion. And there's a whole range of other countries who are also working towards countries or economic blocks that are working towards alignment to ADR. So ASEAN, the League of Arab States, China is working quite closely towards ADR now. And so our major trading partners are doing it. That means that things are being transported in compliance with ADR to get to a ship or a plane to come to Australia, and it gets here. And we have some bespoke rules at the moment that do cause friction. So there's economic efficiencies to be gained by alignment. But, going back to my earlier point, there are things about Australian transport that are a bit more unique, a bit more special. And so we need to account for those.
And Matt, what would be some of those points for people that may not be aware? What would be under the current ADG 7? What would be some of those points of friction based on some of the bespoke rules that we have in Australia? I don't need to list every one, but what would be the top one or two that you kind of heard a lot about that we're looking to address?
Look, probably the most notable one is the Australian requirement to have emergency information panels on IBCs. Yep. Australia is the only country in the world where that's a requirement, and that causes pretty significant costs to industry on arrival. Those IBCs come into Australia generally fully marked and labelled in accordance with the AIDGC Code, which complies with the UN model regulations. They come into Australia and they need to be relabelled. That's a fairly significant hurdle, and that's probably, I'll be honest, it's been one of the more contentious things to change, but it's a pretty significant change. And there's an element of Australia's relationship to the rest of the world from a trading perspective has changed over the past sort of few decades as well. I think the volume of chemicals being imported into Australia over the last 20 years has quadrupled or thereabouts. So,
wow.
We're in a very different world to where we were 20 years ago. And for all of the talk of deglobalization and so on, there's not much evidence of that in the chemical sector.
Yeah, I mean, I've often wondered sort of post-COVID as well in the supply chain. I haven't seen any data, but logically and intellectually, I kind of, and based on what I've seen of my dealings in industry, is that sort of post-COVID and that breakdown in the supply chain, that people are definitely, storing more than they have previously due to, the issues that were encountered during COVID. Now, I don't have any data to back that up, but that's my own personal kind of observation. And so I think you're right. There's the whole, gross quantity coming in, but then I also think post-COVID, there's also this want under some circumstances to stockpile more than they had previously, which obviously needs to then be transported and everything that goes with that and the compliance.
Yeah.
Another thing I was going to ask, Matt, I know we've kind of talked around it, but I want to kind of give the clarity on the podcast about, with the rewrite, what are the major pain points that we're looking to address now? I know we've talked about there's some bespoke, nuances in Australia, but what are those, you don't have to list everyone, but maybe the top 3 or 5 about what are the 3 or 5 pain points that you're looking to target or National Transport's looking to target?
Yeah. One of the things that I've always heard from talking to people who actually work with the code day in, day out, actually applying it, they don't, people who transport stuff, I don't actually have to transport this stuff, is there's often a level of frustration with the way that the code is laid out. People will often mention they get frustrated having to flick back and forth trying to find things. One of the real benefits we get out of aligning to ADR is that ADR was restructured back in around 2000 into a way that sort of follows the transport chain. So the start of the book is about classification and identification of chemicals and those sorts of things, and identification of your dangerous goods. And then you move into what are the requirements for putting it into packages, or a tank or whatever. Then marking and labeling and preparing for consignment, preparing transport documents, those sorts of things. And then beyond that, you move into what do I have to do when I load it onto a truck and transport it down the road or onto a train? And then finally, what does the guy who's sitting up the front of the load in the truck or the train, what do they have to do in order to safely transport these materials? And so probably the biggest surprise that people will get when they read the new code is the layout has changed dramatically. If you are a truck driver, he or she is just going to be able to mainly focus on Part 7 and Part 8 of the ADG Code. They're going to be able to focus in on the area that they need. If you're a consigner, your stuff is going to be further to the towards the front of the code. So nice. Hopefully a more logical flow, yes. A little bit less flicking back and forth, which is which I'm sure people will love. We can't eliminate it entirely, I'm afraid. That's the that's the nature of the beast. But hopefully a little bit more logical. The other thing is a slightly different style in terms of people are probably familiar with special provisions that apply to things generally in the ADG code. Yep. One of the things that gets introduced is special provisions for carriage, which are dealing with the specific things that you might need to do for particular materials. And so much like special provisions, there are additional columns in the ADG code in the DG list to direct you to, I need to do this or I need to do that for these chemicals, or perhaps I'm exempted from doing these things if I'm transporting these materials. So a little bit more granular in that respect, and also gives us the ability to sort of steer people in the right direction, hopefully a little bit quicker.
And I think in my own personal experience, people that are not using the ADG code all of the time, people can struggle with the special revisions and actually understanding the context or the meaning of what this, because it's written in a very technical way. And so I guess, is that something that is changing, or the type of language? Because I understand the challenge of it needs to be technical because you want it to be prescriptive. But then also I feel that sometimes when I go and look at stuff in the ADG code, in particular the special provisions, I kind of read and go, well, I know what that means because I work in dangerous goods. But to a layperson, often they kind of struggle to understand some of that technical language. And I get there's a balance there that you've got to kind of play out. But is there a different approach there, I guess, at all?
There is a little bit of a different approach. One of the things that happens as a result of this is that the special provisions that are the standard special provisions, I might call them, which are focused more at the consigner or classifier. A person who's loading dangerous goods or driving a truck containing dangerous goods, they're not going to need to look at those. And so the special provisions for carriage do tend to be a little bit more targeted towards the actual transport operation. Okay. I can't guarantee that it'll be entirely readable. That's sadly not the world we live in, but it does sort of distill down those things. At the moment, one of the challenges is that you might need to find a provision in a block of text. Now there might be a special provision that you can just be directed to. And one of the things that we've introduced as part of this is a requirement that if there are special provisions of carriage for the goods that you're consigning, that you need to note that on the transport document, and so that sort of gives a driver or a person loading onto a vehicle a fighting chance of actually identifying these. One of the things that we identified as part of this process, which is probably an interesting little story, in the UN model regulations, the requirement to put certain dangerous goods in a enclosed vehicle because they can't get wet is contained in a packing instruction, because that's the only tool that the UN model regulations have for it. One of the benefits we get out of ADR is they take those special provisions, or those special provisions for packing, and they move them into the carriage section as a separate special provision. So, because I would be very surprised if most people ever look at the packing instructions for a particular chemical and find that it needs to be stored and it needs to be transported in an enclosed vehicle. Why would anybody look there? It's an insane place to go looking for it.
Yeah, it's not intuitive that that's where you would look for that information. So yeah,
exactly. So a lot of this sort of information should be a little bit more readily available, more easy to observe. So that's a real benefit, I think, that will flow from this.
Yeah, I think you've explained quite well that, the change will be to a degree like following the process of the supply chain, and so people will look in specific sections depending on their role in that supply chain. But I guess that at the end of this, and once it's out there in industry and being used, like, what does success, look like to the National Transport Commission once it's out there? I get it, we're not working in a perfect world, and so there's degrees of that. But what is success going to look like once it's out there?
Hopefully, people aren't breaking the doors down at the NTC, trying to find the guy who did this.
Well, this podcast is going to go viral, Matt, and everyone's going to know. So
I guess, the job of reforming dangerous goods transport is never done. There's always new problems. There's always, it's oftentimes, as you would know yourself, it's only once you try and apply a rule sometimes that you realize that the rule isn't actually written that well. Yep. And things like that. So there's always going to be work to be done. But I think what we really want to see is we want to see people say, no, this is logical. This does make sense. There was quite a bit of resistance to the idea of a complete rewrite early on, and I get that. That's perfectly.
What do you
logical.
think that? What was? Is that a sort of a bit more of a fear of change, or were there some people that are like, well, it works for us, so why change something in their opinion that's not broken? Or
there's an element of, a pretty significant element of, it works. It mostly works. It's got its flaws, it's got its problems, but it mostly works. Maybe we could just go through and tweak the bits and pieces that we need to fix. There's a lot of work that goes into this. If you look at the range of countries who are directly involved in the writing of ADR, dozens of them, all bringing problems that they identify, all working together to sort of identify solutions. And so we get a lot of benefit out of that. I won't say we're free riders, because we have to do a lot of work on our end to take the work that they've done and make sure it works for Australia. But that means that we can focus in on the areas that we need to focus in on. Much as I would love to have an entire team of people working on continually updating the ADG code, that's not the reality. So we need to sort of target our efficiency. So I think there was a bit of a resistance to change. The ADG 7 has been around for 20 odd years. I've essentially used it my entire career in the world of dangerous goods. I remember a little bit of the ADG 6 era, but not a huge amount. So it's it's familiar.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. All of the countries and the jurisdictions that are helping contribute to the ADR, that we are getting to leverage their knowledge and their experience, right? And so they may have encountered incidents or scenarios that we hadn't experienced in Australia for a whole bunch of reasons, but at least we get access to that information. And then with the way that the National Transport Commission is implementing it, doesn't mean we have to take it all on board, but we get to consider if that would be a scenario, I guess, based on a risk profile, if that's something that's likely to happen to us, and do we need a regulation to help manage that in our environment, right?
Yeah, I've actually got a good example that I came across towards the end of last year, I think it was. Under ADR for a long time, they've had So if you were transporting molten aluminium, for instance, that's dangerous goods. It's a elevated temperature liquid. The interesting thing is that in Europe, I wasn't aware of this. They often transport molten aluminium in pots over long distances. And about a decade ago, there was a crash in Germany, and it was in sort of eastern Germany, but it was a truck carrying 3 pots of molten aluminium from Poland to the western side of Germany. A transport operation that I don't think would ever occur in Australia. It's not a scenario that I'd ever foreseen. And what happened there is they had a rule that said the national regulator sets the rules for these sorts of things, because ADR doesn't have a rule for it. And they got together and said, we should probably do something about this. This is probably something we need to manage. Molten aluminium spilling out on a road is a bit of a hazard.
Absolutely.
And so over the last few years, they've developed a new set of rules for the transport of molten aluminium, and they've gone into the latest edition of ADR as a new special provision. So they're now in there. So now they have a common set of rules, and that's often the way that it works. Something happens, you work out you've got a problem, you come up with a solution to it.
Yes.
And so we're probably not going to adopt that into the new ADG code. Because as far as we can tell, that's not a scenario that occurs in Australia. But should we ever need it, it's there waiting for us. So that's very handy.
No, that's a good example. And do you think there's certain sections or sectors of industry that are going to feel it more than others, or maybe particular roles are going to be more heavily impacted?
I think in particular, and we haven't really spoken about this, is the world of explosives, which is going to see some change, and it's unclear where that's going to lie. So explosives transport is not within the NTC's normal remit. One of the problems that the explosives transporters have faced over the last few years has been the Australian Explosives Code was last updated in 2009. So it's been running a very long time. It's getting quite old and dusty.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was nobody able to devote the time and energy to look after it. Now, Class 1 is 100% a matter for the UN model regulations and for ADR. And so the task we took on was we would incorporate the transport of explosives, the technical requirements for the transport of explosives into the ADG code. And so they're in there now. Now, anybody who's familiar with explosives knows that they are regulated under non-harmonized legislation around the country. And the dangerous goods legislation could be used for the regulation of the transport of explosives, but that's a matter for the explosives regulators to work out how they go from the Australian Explosives Code that is now quite old to the new code and how we manage that. So that's probably the area that is the most up in the air at the moment. We'll need to work with the explosives regulators to facilitate that.
Is it the current intent that in the new version of the ADG code, that Class 1 explosives, in terms of like the technical instructions of how to transport them, would be in the ADG code, but then in terms of the enforcement and other matters are going to be in the state regulations for the transport of explosive? Have I understood that? Or
yeah,
am I
that's
underplaying
right.
it. Yeah. Okay.
No, that's exactly right.
Okay.
The dangerous goods model regulations work perfectly fine, or should work perfectly fine, for the transport of explosives.
Right.
But if you look at explosives legislation generally, it's much broader. Unlike a lot of dangerous goods, on Class 1 dangerous goods, where the storage and handling is regulated under one set of legislation, and the dangerous goods transport is regulated under a separate legislation. In most states and territories, they're handled together, and so you either need to disentangle it entirely, or you need to tweak the existing legislation to focus on that. Like I said, it's also it's a bit outside of our remit at the National Transport Commission. So we're focusing more on facilitating that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a major step forward to have class 1 explosives in the ADG code, right? Like that's not in there today in 7.9. So, that in itself is going to be, a step forward, right? So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that means that the explosives industry and explosives regulators all also get to benefit from those international connections, that 2-yearly update cycle, and that hopefully makes everybody's life just a little bit easier.
Yeah. One of the things that I was interested in as well is that, if you're transporting dangerous goods by air and by sea, there's requirements around training and people need to be trained. And with air, it's a formal process with CASA. And then with road transport, it's more like an awareness type approach. And so I was wondering if that is going to change at all when the new ADG code comes out. Are there going to be any changes in requirements for knowledge and upskilling of what people need to be aware of?
Not immediately in the first instance,
Right.
but if I had a crystal ball and looked into my future, I would see the word training off well into the distance. Training is an area that has worked reasonably well as it is, but maybe not as systematically as we would like.
Yes.
So, there's that obligation in the dangerous goods legislation that says that anybody who's doing a task in dangerous goods has to be trained, instructed, and supervised. But I guess the thing that we've probably been missing is explaining to people what the hell that means. And so one of the things that we got in the National Transport Commission got endorsed to do as part of this work was to prepare a training matrix to sort of steer people in the right direction. So that's a project that is kicking off relatively soon at the time of recording. And that's going to be fairly high level still. But one of the things that we're looking to get out of that is also recommendations for additional work in training. It's going to be a multi-year project. The work on training. One of the requirements that has been introduced into the new code only as a recommendation at this point in time is for dangerous goods safety advisors. So in ADR countries, if you're transporting reasonably significant quantities of dangerous goods, functionally the equivalent to a placard load today.
Okay. Yeah.
You need to have a dangerous goods safety advisor either on staff or engaged in some way to provide expert. To provide expert advice. So that instead of somebody picking up a copy of the ADG code and going, well, where am I going to find this answer? That sort of person is expected to have somebody on tap to go and talk to, and that's a person who has in ADR countries they've had to sit an exam, they've had to go through training in order to be qualified for that. So we don't have that. We don't have the framework for that at the moment. So it's only introduced in the new code as a recommendation that people do that. But it's about signaling that you should find somebody who's good at this and have a relationship with them where you can ask questions and you can solve problems rather than trying to solve it yourself, or worse than that, go, seems all right, I'll just do it.
I've seen all degrees of that. So but I think it's good, and it's sort of like a step in the right direction. And I kind of feel as well that if you tried to do it all in one hit, it's too much. It's too much change, right? And so
100%.
I think doing it in an incremental way and getting people aware of like, this is what best practice looks like.
Yeah, and the other thing that's going on at the moment, there's a bit of work going on with the competent authorities doing some work on the training course for licensed dangerous goods drivers. And so as part of that process, we've learned a few things about maybe what we should and what we shouldn't do. And I'm looking to take a lot of those lessons forward into the training matrix project. And then it becomes a question of, once we start to sort of build these things, do training providers do we start to look at actual formal units of competency and those sorts of things for whether it's a driver, whether it's a person who's packing dangerous goods, things like that. That's obviously a little bit off in the future, but you've got to sort of identify where the problems are before you can get to work on solving them.
Absolutely. One of the other things that I was interested, and I think the listeners would be as well, because there's big changes that we're making with the ADG Code. So what's been the consultation process that the National Transport Commission has gone through to make sure that you get feedback from industry? How have you gone about that?
So early on in the process, there were 12 separate, fairly targeted consultation papers looking at specific issues, and so that involved engagement with both regulators and with industry. Probably more on the specialist side, especially then. The work that was taken there was compiled together, and most of that was targeted at, this is what ADR does. Does it do what we need it to do, and how do we make modifications if we need to, and things like that. And so that was all then consolidated into a consultation regulatory impact statement and a draft ADG code that sort of outlined why we'd got to where we were, and here was the draft code, all 1,200 odd pages of it. And then after that, there's been quite a bit of work since then, about 12 months or more ago, to refine and tweak and make sure that things work, and get it all into a form that is suitable for being put up for approval.
And what does that approval process look like from here, Matt? Like what stage are you at now, and what are the next sort of gates that you need to get through?
Yep. So at the time we're recording this in February of 2026, we at the National Transport Commission, we've sent it off to the approval body. So the Infrastructure and Transport Ministers meeting, which is a meeting of all of the infrastructure and transport ministers from around the country, they meet every 6 months to hash out, transport problems. They're the approving body for the ADG code. Either they or their predecessors have been that body for a long time. So that's been submitted to them. It's got to go. It's got to go out to all the jurisdictions for approval. They all need to. They'll do all of their processes of briefing and reviewing and saying they support it or they don't support it. Fingers crossed they support it. And once that happens, then the code itself is approved. So what we're seeking approval for there is the ADG code itself. In the background at the moment, we're doing the preparatory work for the legislation. And what that will do, that will take the existing legislation and make sure that it properly enables the new ADG code. And once that's approved, it needs to be made in each state and territory. And once that's done, then the new code goes into effect. Simple, right?
Simple, yeah. And so, no, it doesn't sound easy. What are the expectations around timing and the length of this process?
So initially, we were targeting October 2026 for commencement. There's been a few delays that have impacted that. And the other thing that we've done is we've looked forward into the future and said, what is the maintenance of the code going to look like in the future? What sort of timelines do we need in order to take the UN documents and the ADR documents and input from Australian industry and regulators to understand what changes need to be made to each edition, and when can we publish it? And so our target date is probably now the end of March 2027.
Okay.
So March of an odd numbered year is actually very convenient for the commencement of a new edition of an ADG code. So working back from March 2029, March 2027 becomes a reasonable target. Will we hit it? Your guess is as good as mine. Certainly hope so. But that's the aim.
To be clear for everyone, and I guess for myself as well. So even if we said March 2027 is when it came out, it wouldn't actually become mandatory until March 2029. And so there would be this 2-year transition period, or how would that actually work in real terms?
No. So we need to actually work out what the transition is from the current ADG code to the new ADG code, how that works. It's relatively straightforward going from one version of a document to an updated version of the document. When you've got a complete rewrite, things are a little bit more complex.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we need to work. We haven't quite worked out how that will look. There'll be there'll be a bit of work being done to cement that. I guess one of the things, and I'm not sure that we've actually said this yet, so I better make sure I say it.
Okay.
If you're a person who's involved in the transport of dangerous goods today, and I mean on the ground especially, if you're putting dangerous goods in packages, if you're putting packages on pallets, if you're putting pallets on trucks and trains, or if you're driving trucks or trains, your job from February of 2026 to, let's look well into the future and say, February of 2028, probably won't have changed all that much. Where you find the specific rule that says you need to do something might have moved around. The way that rule is worded might have changed slightly, but your day-to-day job is not going to have changed all that much. You're still going to be putting the same diamonds on. You're still going to be, strapping down the load properly. You're still going to not be doing anything stupid while you're driving down the road. So, though the broad brushstrokes, and in fact quite a few of the finer brushstrokes of dangerous goods transport aren't going to change all that much.
Yeah. So when are you expecting that people will be able to see it?
It will be public as soon as possible after it gets approved, because we do actually want people to get their hands on the final version and be able to start thinking about how that's going to affect their operations. The other thing that we're doing as a part of this work is we're going to have a web version of the ADG code. It's basically drawn from the same source document as the PDF, but it has the advantage of, instead of seeing a reference in the ADG code and having to find the page that reference is on, you get all access to all the wonderful things that you get in a web browser, like being able to click on a link and have it pop up. So it take you straight to that provision. So there should be a lot of, I think there's going to be a lot of utility for people in those sorts of things.
And what's the current sort of thoughts and planning in terms of the rollout and making industry aware, and I guess not training per se, but it's more an awareness piece and making, upskilling people to be aware that they need to go and inform themselves to do this. So what's the thoughts and plannings from the National Transport Commission on that front? Yeah,
we really want to make sure that that people are aware this has happened. So it will be blasted out across all of our channels. But we're doing work in the background as well on other supporting documentation. One of the things that I'm looking forward to being really proud of, I can't say I'm proud of it yet because it's not finished, is a guide for businesses who transport dangerous goods. So one of the things we've been missing in for quite some time is sort of a guide to where to find a guide to how the ADG code works and the dangerous goods framework works. Plain English, not trying to get away from some of that code language. And sort of helping people find the things they need to find. So that's absolutely on the cards. Information about where the requirements have moved, especially the key ones. Because with the fairly substantial restructure, it's going to be it will be a little bit of a shock to try and find things that you always knew where they were.
Yeah, completely. I know from doing training about the AIDGC Code and see, like the Australian Maritime Safety Authority have brought out, which I'm sure you've seen, they've got that short book, which is not exactly what you're talking about, but it's a similar type thing, right? Where they, have the definition of what limited quantities are and things that people would typically look up. And that is getting a bit long in the tooth now. But I say to people, well, this is explaining to you concepts and key principles that aren't really going to change. And yes, the dangerous goods and the dangerous goods lists are going to get updated, and there's going to be new products come in there like sodium-ion batteries and all these things. But having something that explains it to business, I think, would be amazing. And I'll often be on calls as well where someone's going to start importing products that are dangerous goods. They haven't done that before, and they kind of don't know where to start. And I think having those types of resources is invaluable.
Yeah, it's 100% something that we want to make sure is out there. The ADG code is one of our most downloaded documents for the NTC. It's one.
Do you have any stats you could share? Like, do you know the stats about how often it gets downloaded?
Not off the top of my head, but our publishing team do like to do note frequently that it's downloaded many more times than
anything.
Many of our other documents. And that's just a function of the fact that people actually use this thing every day in their daily lives.
Completely. So I know I'm probably helping bump those stats up because I probably downloaded it 3 times a week, but maybe I'm not the normal user. How do you see the progression of the ADG code once we've got this sort of, a flag in the ground of getting this major rewrite better aligned to the ADR? What does the future look like, and how does what we're doing today kind of set that up?
As soon as the ADG code is in effect, we're straight into the 2-yearly maintenance cycle, where we're already there. So one of the things that we're sort of working on is what does maintenance look like? How do we get from this version of the ADG code to the next version of the ADG code? And alongside that, what policy work should we be doing to deal with that? So policy is more of a sort of a shift in the way we treat something. An example: there's a few things in the new ADG code that we would have liked to have got to, but we didn't. Regulation of diesel as dangerous goods is one that's cropped up many times over the years. We're not looking to regulate diesel like the same as we do for petrol, but one of the things that we identified during this process is that the level of regulation is too low. And so we need to come up with an appropriate level, but that requires things like regulatory impact statements and proper analyses and those kinds of things. So what we will do is we'll run policy work in parallel to the maintenance work, and then if the policy work is ready, when we get to the next version of the ADG code, that policy work can fall into that stream and wind up in the new code. So a lot of it is about coming up with a systematic process for the future for the long-term future of the ADG code. As I said before, one of the challenges we had in ADG 7 is the sheer volume of Australian-specific content made it very difficult to actually focus in on the things that needed to be focused in on. Because we can take advantage of the work that is being done internationally. That means that we can now focus in on those things that are Australian specific and say, is this setting right? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to make a change? What international experience is there from non-ADR countries that we might need to draw on? And so it's all about maintaining a long-term sustainable program to keep it updated, modern, and effective.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. What would be, one key message that you would want the industry to understand about the new version of the ADG code?
I think it's that message that I said before. The day-to-day isn't going to change all that much. There will be a bit of work to work out where things have moved, but get familiar with the new code. Try and understand the sort of the logical flow of the code and the way that the different parts interact. I think relatively quickly it will feel comfortable. It's not all that different.
If people want to stay up to date with things that are happening with the ADG code and the National Transport Commission, what's the best way for people to do that, Matt?
Go to our website, www.ntc.gov.au.
I'll put the details in the notes of the podcast so people can go and find it.
Yeah, and there's a subscription link to sign up to newsletters and things like that. If you select dangerous goods, you'll get to hear from me from time to time. If you're interested in other things, there are other options. Obviously, there's always work going on with heavy vehicles and trains and child restraints. The NTC does some weird and wonderful stuff.
I noticed that when I went and subscribed a few months ago, I was surprised with all the things the National Transport Commission, like, oh, you do more than dangerous goods. So I thought that was it. I actually did know about the heavy vehicle stuff, but yeah, so there were some other things on there that surprised me. And so, Matt, is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you also wanted to share with the listeners?
No, I think that was a fantastic discussion about the new ADG code.
It's good. Look forward to it. It'll be interesting on a number of fronts, and I kind of feel the things we've talked about make a lot of sense, and I think it's going to make some positive change in the industry. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us today, Matt.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Dave.